we're going to read Bright Night together. So please get your book, put it in front of you, and be ready to follow along as I read. Bright Night, the story of Anne Bradstreet. Written by Nancy Wilson. Illustrations by Louise Brewer. We will begin on page 7. Do you know Anne Bradstreet? She grew up in England long ago. She was slight as a garden wren, but full of fun. Her house was big and grand and had many a shelf of shining books. So she was born in England. She was born into a wealthy family in England. Remember what that word slight means? It says she was slight as a wren. Slight, the way it's used in this sentence, means slim. She was tall and slim. Notice the wren on the chair. See the little garden wren? That's a bird. When she was a girl, she was taught to read, and she sought out tales of knights and gnomes, fights, flights, and frights. She sat on her papa's knee, and he would read into the night. What do you think it means when it says knights and gnomes, fights, flights, and frights? You have lots of rhyming words there. What type of stories do you think she liked as a kid? She enjoyed adventure stories. She enjoyed fiction stories. She enjoyed scary stories. So basically, she just loved to read, and that filled her mind with all kinds of images that later on helped her in her poetry. She was taught to knead bread to bake, and knit and spin with silk and wool. She would sigh when she caught sight of ink and pen, for Anne wrote fine rhymes for men. Why do you think Anne would sigh when she caught sight of her ink and pen? Remember, at that time they had to use an inkwell like you did during the colonial days. Why would she sigh? Well, she had lots of work to do. See here, she was taught how to sew. She was taught how to bake. Women had lots of jobs during this time. Things were not as easy as they are now. And so, just to provide a meal was a big deal. To wash laundry was a long task. There were lots of things to be done around the house. And oftentimes there wasn't enough time for even girls to study at this time, much less to write. She caught smallpox and was ill a long time. She could not eat a crumb and was half numb with fever. Yet Anne fought the blight till she was well. Blight means illness. She was very sick with a disease called smallpox, but she was able to slowly recover. She was wed to Simon Bradstreet when she was 16 years old. Anne and Simon left England soon after and went on a ship to a new land. During this time period, the colonial era and before, people got married much sooner than we do during this time. When the sea was still, the stars shone bright in the night sky, and Anne thought of her new home in New England. When the waves were high and the sea was harsh, the wild wind did howl, and storms did roar and rage. The ship did knock and wrench on the sea, yet they did always trust God and pray for a safe landing. So here you see the picture of England, and here is New England, okay? They're crossing the Atlantic. We talked a lot about what that adventure was like for these pilgrims and these early settlers crossing the Atlantic. Many times they didn't know if they would make it, but by the Lord's mercy, Anne Bradstreet and her husband did make it safely to land. One morning, they stood on the deck and caught sight of land. The ship went straight for the shore. They were full of thanks that they did not sink or wreck on the beach. With joy, Anne wrote home right away to tell of her brave sail. She couldn't call her family. She couldn't text her family or even send them an email. She had to write a letter, and then she would send it back on the next ship that would go back to England, and that could be weeks or months. And only then would her family know if she was safe and if she had arrived in New England. Wow, very different from the way it is for us now. There in the new land, Anne had her children. She brought them up and taught them to love and praise God so that they might do no wrong, but only right as they ought. Anne wrote about her children and her life. She had a knack for writing sweet poems, and it brought her much joy. Anne was known to be a wise, meek, and good wife. And they had 8 children. If you count them, they're all there. Notice Anne is getting a little bit older now. When Anne was old, her son did ask her to write for him all she knew of life and love and God. He knew this was more than all that could be bought with gold. She wrote it all down for her son. Some in the town thought Anne should not write, but should only sew and spin. And that just goes back to what we were just talking about. Women, their jobs were hard. They had a lot to do just to care for a home. And so some people thought that women shouldn't do anything else but that it was wrong for them to take time away from their family to do something else besides cooking and sewing and cleaning. Anne, however, we know from history that she was a very industrious woman, and she managed her household well, and she taught her kids to love the Lord. And you see her sitting by candlelight, writing her poems. She found time to do what she loved. Yet she sought to love God in all she wrote. She wrote of yellow trees and swimming lakes, of sky and cloud and wood and knoll. Knoll is a small hill. In all, she saw God's good hand, a calf, a wren, a gnat, All were his, and naught was too small for him to reach. And naught means nothing. Nothing was too small for him to reach. The Bible tells us that a sparrow, which is a bird, not even a sparrow falls to the ground without God knowing it. God reigns over all of his creatures, even the smallest ones, like a gnat. One night, Anne and Simon did smell smoke. The sky was bright with puffs of smoke that rose from the roof. The house was in a wreath of flames. The night was bright with the light of the fire. A wreath of flames means the flames went around the house like a circle. It was engulfed in flames. The porch was black, the windows shook, the stair did break, the roof fell in. They did try with all their might to stop the fire, but it did burn all the night. Now, notice what they're using to try to put out this fire. Do you see? They're using buckets of water because they didn't have a fire station and firemen to come and douse the house with massive amounts of water. They would have to run to the well or to a brook, fill up buckets, and try to put that fire out. And so often it just wasn't enough. They just couldn't do it, but they tried. Doesn't that make you thankful for fire stations and firefighters? In the morning, the house was no more. Anne saw all her nice things lost to the fire. Her chest, her bed, her bench, her clock. She wrung her hands. She wept with sad sobs. They felt like wretches. Was this God's wrath? No doubt these were things that she had brought from England with her that were very special to her. It's hard to lose things like that, especially in a fire, where your whole house is gone. And so they began to question, was God angry at them? Had they done something wrong? And here's the answer they came to. No. Then did Simon and Anne kneel and thank God for their plight. They would not speculate about God's plan for them, for he would bless. They were dependent on his grace and would not let this loss hurt their faith. These are questions people ask when hard things happen. But Simon and Anne did not allow their emotions to get the better of them. They allowed their faith to outweigh the feelings that they had. And they knew that God had a plan for them. And God promises his people that he does have a plan for them, even when things are hard. And notice it says, for he would bless. God shall bless us, and all the ends of the earth shall fear him. The bright night was to them fraught with fright and loss. Fraught means full of. That bright night, what was that bright night? It was the night their house was engulfed in flames. And it was a terrible night. They were fearful. They lost everything. Yet, the night shone bright with the light of God's help and love and care. Anne and Simon knew God was good, and they did trust him to show his might and kindness to them. Anne wrote a poem about the fire in her house and how God taught her to rest in his good gifts. She also wrote poems about her grandchildren. Some of her newborn grandchildren got sick and did die. It was sad to put the babes in their graves. Yet, in all the hard times, Anne could still love and praise God. Another thing that was very different about this time from the period in which we live is that not only did they not have fire stations, but many of these colonies did not have hospitals. that was a good ways in the future, and they might not even have an established doctor who could really help in times. And so many times there might be complications in childbirth, and children would not live to be very old. And it's a difficult time. One day a book came that had Anne's name on it. It was full of Anne's poems, and it came from a printing shop in England. Anne was dumb at the sight of the book. That means she couldn't speak. She had never thought of printing her poems. She thought some were too coarse to be in a book. She wrote them out one more time so they would be right. How do you think Anne's poems ended up being printed in a book when she didn't do it herself? Who do you think might have had her poems printed? Think back earlier in the book. Who really wanted to have her poems written down? If you're thinking her son, you're right. I think her son might have had something to do with the fact that her poems got printed, but we're glad that they did because we can still read them today. Today, you can find Anne Bradstreet's book of poems and read them yourself. You will see what a wise and true saint she was. Now you know Anne Bradstreet. And isn't that kind of neat that I doubt before you read this book you knew of Anne Bradstreet, and now you know how God used her, and that we can read her poetry today. All right, do you see the little wren on the chair beside this little girl? Now, this is supposed to be like a little girl, in our modern day, reading Anne's poems. But look at that little wren. Do you remember yesterday when I challenged you to find something that was the same in all the pictures? Did any of you figure out what it is? Well, that little wren is your clue. If you notice that in every single page there is a little wren, you got it. Good eyes. If you didn't notice that, go back through the book, look at every page, and you will see that little wren somewhere in the picture. Okay, Anne's poems. Now, the book that she wrote, with all of her poems that were put together, is still, it was put into a book. I tried to purchase that book a year or so ago, and it's actually rather hard to find. And if you find a copy, it's extremely expensive. So I wish I could show you a copy of Anne's poetry, but it's a little difficult to get your hands on. But here's the title of that book: The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America. Whew, that is quite a title, isn't it? But that's what they called her collection of poetry. In that collection, she wrote a poem, as the book said, about the fire that took their house that night. It is a beautiful poem. Oh my goodness, I love the faith and just the genuineness that comes out in her poem. However, it's quite long. So just for the sake of time, I'm not going to read it to you, but I sure wish I could. So much to be learned from it. What I am going to do, though, is I am going to read, just very briefly, a cute little poem that she wrote about her children. And this was written in 1659. So listen to this poem. I had 8 birds hatched in one nest. 4 cocks there were, and hens the rest. I nursed them up with pain and care, nor cost nor labor did I spare, till at last they felt their wing, mounted the trees and learned to sing. Chief of the brood then took his flight to regions far, and left me quite. My mournful chirps I after send, till he returned, or I do end. Leave not thy nest, thy dam and sire, fly back and sing amidst this choir. Well, what I usually do with my students is we really talk through this poem and we figure out all the imagery that's going on here. I'm not going to take the time to do that because this video is getting a little long. But what this is about her children. And she's using the picture of a mother bird and having 8 little eggs in her nest. And then they hatch. 4 of them are boys, 4 of them are girls. And then they grow up. And then what do? What do birds do when they grow up and leave their nest? They fly away. And she gives this imagery of standing there, that mama bird. And she says, my mournful chirps I after send. That mama bird stands there and chirps as she watches her birds fly away. And that means her kids grew up and they got married and they left home. And she was, in a sense, just saying, I wish you would just come back. Notice it says, fly back and sing amidst this choir. She was wishing that her kids could just come back and be with the family. And I'm sure at times they were. But that's just a picture of a mom's heart. And sometimes the struggle that it is to watch your kids grow up and leave. All right, guys, that is it for Bright Night today.